Okay. Greetings to you all, wherever you might be. And we're happy to have you among us for another interesting seminar that will be given by Dr. James Motegi from the African Plant Nutrition Institute. Dr. James Motegi is a native of Kenya, and he is the Senior Program Manager for East and Southern Africa for the African Plant Nutrition Institute based in Nairobi, Kenya. James has years of work experience as a development scientist with a focus on cropping systems, soil fertility, fertilizer systems, project management, and development of multi-level partnerships in sub-Saharan Africa. James holds a PhD in soil fertility and climate change from the University of Aarhus in Denmark, an MSc in environmental science with focus on soil, nutrient, and water dynamics from Kenyatta University, and a Bachelor of Science in Dryland Management from the University of Nairobi, Kenya. Prior to joining APNI, the African Plant Nutrition Institute, James was the Deputy Director of the East and Southern African Program of the former International Plant Nutrition Institute. Yes, that's the mother institution that gave shoot to APNI. Today, Dr. James Motegi will share with us his valuable knowledge on the topic of nutrient management, recommendations, climate variability, and soil health in East Africa. And before that, I'd like to thank you for having accepted to speak to our students, staff, and partners throughout the world. And I want to express my sincere thanks to you for receiving our students in the different stations that are supervised by APNI. Thank you very much. Now you will have about, let's say, 40 minutes of speech. You can go beyond. We're not going to stop you. And that will be followed by 20 minutes Q&A from our viewers. So Dr. James Motegi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mohamed. Thank you very much, everyone who is joining this presentation today. As Mohamed has told you, my name is James Motegi. I work for APNI. I'm a senior program manager and also the team leader for soil and livelihoods. And so the topic of my presentation today is nutrient management recommendations, climate variability, and soil health, a focus on East Africa. So I've been giving highlights on those three things. It's not possible to finish everything about nutrient management, but rather I'll give some highlights of most important things that happen in as far as nutrient management, climate variability, and soil health is concerned in East Africa. So this is the way I'll structure my presentation. I'll start with introduction. I'll then talk about soil health, soil nutrient recommendations, and climate challenges we are facing in East Africa. I'll talk about the solutions to address these challenges. And finally, I'll talk about taking those solutions to the beneficiaries. So to start with, we know that achieving sustainable global food security is one of the humanity's contemporary challenges. The greatest problems facing humankind right now can be linked to soils, climate, food, and environment. We know that resource degradation is a common challenge attributed to unsustainable agricultural practices. If we revert and reduce the rate of degradation, improve soil health, and adapt systems that improve climate change, it's possible to sustain productivity, resilience, and manage the environment. So as I've said, I'll start with the challenges that we're facing in Sub-Saharan Africa. And so one of the greatest challenges that we're facing in Sub-Saharan Africa is food insecurity, because majority of the people who do farming in sub-Saharan Africa are smallholder farmers who are often poor smallholder farmers. And so we find that the crop yields in East Africa are generally 50% below realistically attainable potential. And the levels of malnourishment, as you can see from the map there, the places that are red indicate the levels of malnourishment. The levels of malnourishment in East Africa are estimated at between 20 and 35%. You can see from the map that are almost 3/4 of the map is red, indicating that the levels of malnourishment cut across most of the places in East Africa. And so, first of all, the high yield gaps are very common, and the graph I'm showing there is a graph of high yield gaps in Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. The dotted line up here is the attainable yield, and these countries, the production is below here, where you're seeing the red line, the bluish line, and the green line. So basically, then it means that we are producing maize at approximately 20%, whereas we can be able to grow it to up to 8 tons. We're actually producing at the level of an average of 1.5 to 2 tons in East Africa. For the other crops, beyond the maize, crops like bananas, potatoes, and the common beans, which are also common in East Africa, we find that a crop like maize, whereas it has a potential of up to 25 tons per hectare, in actual sense, the farmers get only 7.5 tons per hectare. Crop like potato is even more difficult story, because whereas it has a potential that up to 35 tons per hectare, farmers are getting approximately 12.5 tons per hectare, which is approximately threefold less than what they could acquire if they were to hit the attainable yield. It's the same story for common beans, again 0.7 against 3.5 tons per hectare. And on average, these differences represent a lower yield by between 100 and 200%, implying that the farmers are producing at a very low level compared to the attainable yield. Climate change is another challenge that we're facing in East Africa. And so that map there shows the kind of impact that is expected due to climate change. And so it's expected that the attainable yields are projected to decrease by 15% in sub-Saharan Africa, with the East Africa included. For maize, we expect that those yields will decrease by 15%. For rice, we expect that those yields will decrease by 11%. And for wheat, we expect that those yields will decrease by 4%. The other problem that we see is low inherent soil fertility. And so this low inherent soil fertility indicate a number of indicators of low inherent soil fertility, especially because these are tropical soils that are characterized by low nutrient reserves, aluminum toxicity, P-fixing soils are widely spread across the regions where we work, and they have low effective cation exchanging capacity. The crops on the other side show the kind of variance of nutrient deficiencies that you observe in the field, and nitrogen deficiencies, pin deficiencies, cane deficiencies, secondary nutrient deficiencies, and micronutrient deficiencies are common in most of the places where we work in East Africa. Soil acidification is a common problem that is hitting across East Africa. And the table that I showed there shows that for regions where we work, like Ethiopia, the arable land is estimated to be acidic, in the range of more than 40%. In Rwanda, more than 40% of the soils are estimated to be acidic. In Kenya, more than 20%. In Tanzania, more than 20%. And the way we know is that with the soils that are acidic, most of the nutrients that we apply to the crop are not actually available to those crops. Rather, they are fixed by aluminium and iron into complexes that cannot release those nutrients for the crop to use, and therefore farmers end up incurring losses, and the yields are generally low because of acidification and its fixing capacity of most of the nutrients that are crucial for crop production. Nutrient depletion and negative nutrient balances is another common problem in East Africa. And so the map I showed there, if you look at the region that is red, it shows that the depletion in East Africa, actually East Africa is the most depleted region, especially for the macronutrients, because it is in the range of very high to high, which is nutrient depletion of from 20 to more than 33 kilogram per hectare per year of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Low soil organic matter is another problem that we have, and like you can see from this graph, with the low soil organic matter, as the low soil organic matter increases, the crop yield also decreases because it's an indicator of degradation. But we know organic matter affects various aspects of production. They affect the soil fertility, the soil chemistry, because it's organic matter that actually acts as the reservoir of most of the nutrients that the crop take up. They affect the soil and biological processes because the respiration and all the processes going with decomposition, mineralization, nitrification are controlled by the soil organic matter. And they affect the soil physical properties because soil organic matter influences the soil structure and other issues around the soil physical parameters that would affect the way the crop's roots, like root penetration, infiltration is affected, infiltration of water is affected, the root penetration is affected, and therefore crops are not able to root deep enough to be able to take up the nutrients and the water that is in the soil. We know that increasing organic matter by only 1% would increase available water capacity by more than 12,000 liters per acre of the medium texture soils, because organic matter is also associated with the building up of the soil water holding capacity. So the moment we have low soil organic matter, then we have a lot of challenges in terms of the way the soils deal with soil fertility, soil biological processes, and soil physical properties. Erosion is very common and a very huge problem in the regions where we work. And we know that massive soil erosion is common in West Africa. It's driven by slopes, partly by slopes, because farmers are farming on slopes that are very steep, driven by erodibility of the soils where the farmers farm, and driven also by the rainfall erosivity. And we expect that as climate change becomes a problem and we get the torrential rains falling on certain parts without proper distribution across the season, then the rainfall erosivity will become a serious problem in as far as eroding soils is concerned. This leads to loss of topsoil, the soil nutrients get lost, and the soil organic matter get lost as well. It's estimated that among the soil loss of 10 tons per hectare per year, it is estimated that soils lose an average of 28 kilograms of nitrogen, 10 kilograms of P, and 33 kilograms of K per hectare per year, plus secondary and the micronutrients. If you look here, you see why that erosion is a problem, because these are typical example of some of the places where farming is going on in East Africa. In Kenya, in central Kenya, in eastern Kenya, in Rwanda, in most of the parts of Rwanda, in most of the parts of Ethiopia, you find this kind of slopes and farmers are farming there. So these soils are left in bare, they are steep, often exceeding 20% slope, but even going beyond 50% sometimes, 50% slope sometimes. And they're characterized, they are very highly erodible, there is high rain water erosivity, and therefore this pushes the erosion to very high estimates. The table here is a table that I compiled from studies that have been carried out in Eastern Africa. So you look at a country like Ethiopia, is estimated that up to 1.5 billion tons tons of soils is lost per year. You can imagine the kind of nutrients, the amounts of nutrients that are lost with that level of losses. In Rwanda, studies for that and districts shown that there are soil erosion of between 170 to 990. In other countries like Tanzania, again, very high erosion levels. Uluguru slopes in Tanzania, between 45 and 275 tons per hectare per year. In Kenya, certain regions up to 549 tons per hectare per year of soil. So this indicates huge losses of soil, loss of the rooting depth where the crops can easily root, and also loss of nutrients, both the macros, the micros, and the macros, the secondary and the micronutrients with this soil that is lost down the slope, sometimes also becoming a problem to the water bodies because it's deposited into the water bodies. The other problem that we have is a problem of low fertilizer use efficiency, again, very common, and we know that it have multiple soil limitations, there are multiple soil limitations affecting resource capture efficiency and the resource conversion efficiencies, leading to low fertilizer use efficiency. If you look at that table there, you find that the ranges of agronomic end use estimated by a number of studies range from around 10 to around 18. But in actual sense, the optimal agronomic efficiency of N should go up to 25, should go even beyond 25 kilograms per kilogram if the fertilizer is handled in the proper way. There are a range of other factors that are basically related to management. The carbon nitrogen stocks are declining and is deteriorating also physical characteristics. These are graphs of chronosequence of land use change from when some of the places used to be forest. What you see at the upper level of the curve, where the value is high for soil carbon stock, is at the point when land is not converted to forest. But through the chronosequence estimates that when land is converted to forest within a very short time of like 20 years, then the carbon levels drop significantly by almost 80%. And by the time it's around 20 years, it stabilizes at a certain point. The same trend of loss of nitrogen stock over time, within a very short time, dropping by more than 60% and stabilizing at a certain point, can also be shown in this second graph. Basically, what it indicates is that there has been a deterioration in terms of deterioration of the carbon and nitrogen stocks across some of the regions where we are working. And this can also be shown in this other graph that is showing the bulk density, where the bulk density has continued to go up. And the bulk density is an indicator of grounds that are becoming harder grounds where penetration resistance is starting to set in. Roots are finding it more difficult to penetrate the ground and take up water and the nutrients. And also infiltration of water is becoming a problem, and therefore such difficulties in infiltration of water can easily be associated with the runoff, can actually cause a lot of runoff across these regions where we work. There is also limited use of balanced fertilizers. You find that what the table I put here is an example of Kenya. And the majority of farmers basically are using nitrogen and phosphorus types of fertilizer. There is little inclusion of the second and the micronutrients. Down here, we see that the second and micronutrients are only like 3% of the for example, only like 3% of the 600,000 metric tons of fertilizer that is used in a country like Kenya. The case is similar for Tanzania, the case is similar for Ethiopia, the case is similar for other countries within Eastern Africa. But also beyond this, the levels of use of fertilizer nutrients are low. We know that the Abuja declaration emphasized that the fertilizers should go up to 50 kilograms of nutrients per hectare per year by 2015. But in actual sense, if you look at these values, like Kenya is using between 25 to 35 kilograms of nutrients per hectare. Uganda averages at 8 to 15 kilograms of nutrient per hectare. Tanzania between 15 and 20, but the world average is at 115 kilogram per hectare. Shows that we are not able to deal with the type of losses that are introduced by various other parameters that I've described before. We are not able to return the nutrients, and these nutrients get lost from the system through addition of fertilizer. We are showing that most of the farmers are using nitrogen and phosphorus, but in actual sense, if you look at this graph that was done through a review that was carried by some of our colleagues for 14 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, including Kenya, Tanzania, and Ethiopia, what you find is that whereas the crops across different soil types are responding to the macronutrients, there is also a significant response to the micronutrients, and of course, I did not include the second nutrient and also the secondary nutrients. And therefore, the unit gaps, sometimes resulting from the fact that the crops are not able to access all the nutrients that are essential, including the secondary and the micronutrients. Rather, most of the fertilization is based on the nitrogen and phosphorus, or rather the macronutrients. In addition to that, the variable soils across Africa, coupled with blanket recommendations. So irrespective of the fact that the soils are variable across Africa, even within one country, soils are very variable. Blanket recommendations are very common in East Africa. For example, you find a country like Kenya, irrespective of where we are within Kenya, Kenya has the eastern zone, has the central zone, has the western zone, and the soils are totally different in those different regions. But irrespective of where you are, you have only one recommendation for maize. Irrespective of where you are, if you're producing millet, you have only one recommendation. Irrespective of where you are, if you are producing sorghum, you have only one recommendation. Most of these recommendations fall short in terms of the nutrients that they supply. They either oversupply a certain nutrient or missing certain other nutrients, or totally fail to supply certain nutrients while piling up other nutrients. It's important as we think about the challenges also to think about how to address this concern, and the studies that we've carried out over time and those that have been carried out by our partners have shown how we can address these concerns. And the first thing we should think when addressing this concern is about developing efficient fertilizer recommendations. And what I showed there is a model that is called SMART. The SMART fertilization recommendation concept was actually developed by IFDC, APNI, and IPI. And it's a model that emphasizes, that it shows the steps of developing a fertilizer recommendation. So it shows that you need to start with the soil analysis, from soil analysis, which can be done either with wet chemistry or spectral. Then you need to do the mapping to identify where within the country the deficiencies. Using the soil analysis and the maps, you can develop recommendations, both in terms of the nutrients required for different regions, but also the rate of application of those nutrients. And the process of developing recommendations requires both the first stage of developing and then validation in the field, so as to establish whether those recommendations actually can stand the test of time over a period of time. Now, doing all this does not solve the problems until you transfer those technologies to the farmers. And so what I show in the 4D panel here is a situation whereby farmers are then being trained on exactly how to use these recommendations, because remember, farmers are not scientists, and therefore they don't know, in most cases, they don't know how to interpret recommendations and how to use them in the field, in their fields. Number two is that there's a lot of soil mapping and fertilizer formulation in Africa. There are a range of initiatives of soil nutrient mapping as a basis for identifying deficient nutrients. These efforts are supported by development partners across the regions where we work. They're supported by the government and research institutions. Key examples of these initiatives that we have seen on the ground are initiatives like APSIS meaning Africa Fertilizer System, APSIS meaning Africa Fertilizer Information Systems, that is mapping that's daily mapping for more than 10 countries in Africa, identifying which nutrients are found in certain places and are not found in certain places, which areas are deficient in macronutrients, which areas have deficiencies in certain secondary nutrients, and which areas have deficiency in certain micronutrients, and which areas have combination of all those micronutrients, and how they can be combined, or they can be combined to form formulation. Country-specific are also initiated out of APSIS, initiating their own initiatives, like in Tanzania, TANSIS, Tanzania Soil Information Service, that is actually mapping across Tanzania also to establish what type of soils you have in Tanzania and what sort of deficiencies farmers need to address to solve the problems of nutrient deficiency. In Ethiopia, again, we have EDIOSIS that has done a lot of work in Ethiopia. Those maps are here, and the lessons that we learn from these maps, what I'm showing you is the maps or soil fertility status for Tigray region in Ethiopia. They are maps that were done by APSIS, and what I'm showing, if you look at different colors, you'll find that in different regions, nutrients for different regions vary. Like, for example, the organic matter, there are places where you see red is where it's very low, and so you can see there are almost 20% of that country, as almost 20% of that region would be classified as low organic matter region. There are problems with the total nitrogen, problems with the potassium, and other nutrients, including the zinc, which is a micronutrient, whereby you see a significant amount of land in the Tigray region has very low to low zinc levels, and like I said initially, most of these micronutrients were not found in the fertilizers that are planted in that country. But in that country, out of that sampling that is distributed, as you can see in the first map, in that region, out of the sampling that was distributed, as you can see in this map, they were able to develop different fertilizer blends that would address deficiencies in different zones within that specific region. And so what we see here are combinations like NPKSB, combinations like NPS, combinations like NPS zinc, depending on the type of deficiencies that are found in different regions in that country. It's not just in Ethiopia, but it has also happened in Rwanda. And again, we can see there are regions in green are regions which have adequate supply of the nutrients that are shown there. But the regions that are inland are indicators of those regions that do not have sufficient supply, do not have sufficient nutrients, those nutrients in the soils. And so what we can see here then is that there are diversity of limitations in terms of nutrients across the country. In Kenya, it has also been done in Kenya. The regions that have green, like if you look at the potassium, for a long time there has been a myth in Kenya that potassium is sufficient, but using these maps that were done for Western Kenya by CropNut and the 1 Acre Fund, we can see that there are regions where a significant amount of size of area does not have sufficient potassium. And also for other crops, for other nutrients as well, we can see there are regions with the adequate, regions with inadequate, emphasizing on importance of having balanced nutrient management that is cognizant of deficiency and the variability across the regions where we work. But something that strikes us is that whereas initially soil nutrient management recommendations will be done by use of soil fertility information, some of the standards that have been carried out recently have shown that there is limited correspondence between crop yield response and soil properties, implying a need for crop response trial, implying that you cannot just use the soil properties to develop fertilizer recommendations and deliver it to the farmer and show the farm and advise the farmers to use that successively. Therefore, this implies that there is a need for crop response trial to fine-tune the soil-based fertilizer recommendations. The graphs I'm showing here, you can see on the x-axis the soil organic matter in the first graph and the relative response, the soil available P and the relative P response. Basically, there is no increase. There's no increase in response as a function of soil available, as a function of increase in soil available P. The same case for K, and therefore indicating that there is limited correspondence between crop yield response and soil properties. And probably then this should be just used as the first step of developing recommendations that should then be followed up with a crop response trial to fine-tune the recommendation that is based on these soil properties. Understanding crop response to specific nutrients and nutrient combination is crucial for designing balanced nutrient management and recommendation. A common tool for understanding nutrient interactions and contribution that we use within APNI and other partner institutions is a nutrient omission trial. It involves a stage-wise omission of nutrients in the design to identify the yield dependencies attributable to specific nutrients. So the table here shows the typical example of a nutrient omission trial too. And in this nutrient omission trial, the first treatment that I'm showing there is a full treatment, including the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, zinc, and boron. And then stage-wise, we omit one nutrient. The second line shows an omission of potassium, and therefore that can be used to identify the effect of potassium on production. The second shows an omission of sulfur, can be used to identify what happens when you omit sulfur. The other one, zinc, can be used to evaluate the impact of zinc on production. The other one, omission of boron. And then the last one, 6, the 6 is the nitrogen and phosphorus, which basically gives us the result to show where farmers start now that they don't use a lot of balanced fertilizers with the macronutrients and macronutrients. Where do they stand in terms of production? Of course, the last one is control, that does not have where we do not add any nutrients. I want to show this graph that was done by one of our colleagues here, Samuel Jologe. And this graph was done through work that we did in Western Kenya. And so what we see is that from the control, the yield increases with inclusion of various nutrients. But more so is that depending on variability, there are certain places where you find that K, the potassium that initially there was a myth that it doesn't contribute. There is K response, and even in this situation, the NK performs better than the NP. But the balanced one, which includes the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, performs much better than all the other treatments. Probably because it was able to supply a range of nutrients that would have limited crop performance, including the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Micronutrients, we said, have not commonly been used in East Africa, but the use of micronutrients is gaining momentum. And so this graph I'm showing here was done by AFDC. And they show the blue shows what you get for the control. And the one thing that I like about this blue is that it also shows you that farms and the regions are not the same, because there are certain farms where with the control you get only zero. In this case, they got only 0.4 tons per hectare. There are certain other places where with the control they got 1 ton. There are certain other places where with the control without foundations they got 2.8 tons. There are certain other places where they got up to 3.7 tons. But with the inclusion of the NPK, the NPK then comes on the land part of the bar and contributes in the first crop, contributes up to 2.7 tons addition to increases the yield by 2.7 tons. In the second column by 2 tons, in the third column by 1.7 tons, in the fourth column by 0.8 tons per hectare. The most important thing for us to see here is that the contribution of the second and the micronutrient that is in green. And so what we see is that where it's omitted in most cases in the fertilizers, we see that there are places where it's increasing yield by up to 2.2 tons, by up to 1.6 tons. And yet we know that addition of micronutrients, we know that addition of micronutrients is less expensive, is cheap. So that's increase, if you have to do the economic analysis, that's more increase there would have significant benefit cost ratio. This is the work we are doing, APNI and AGRA in Kenya. And so what we are showing is the situation where you have the control, a situation where you have the NNP, a situation where you have the NPK, a situation where we have the NPKs, and a situation where we have NPKs and magnesium in central Kenya. And what we see is a consistent increment. It's a consistent increment in this region when you move from the control to NP to a more balanced one with NPK to a much more balanced one with NPKs to even a much more balanced one with NPKs and magnesium. And so whereas the farmer with the control will be stuck at 2.7 tons per hectare, the farmer who is applying balanced fertilizers would hit something like 5.7 tons per hectare in this kind of a situation. One thing that we also have been looking at is complementary with ISFM, and in this case, I'm presenting a graph that was done by Chivinge, who is one of our colleagues. And so it's complementarity of organic or inorganic fertilizer. We know organics have their own, fertilizers have their own, because organics will basically work on the soil physical properties, including the soil structure, including the earthworms boring the soils, and therefore the roots finding it easy to penetrate the soil, and so they contribute to something in terms of the nutrient use efficiency. But fertilizers become available almost immediately after application, and so the issues of synchrony and asynchrony, whereby fertilizers can easily be synchronized to deliver nutrients to the crop as to when it requires it, becomes important. So what we find is that organic resources, the production with organic resources is not as high as with the fertilizer, but the best production scenario is actually where you have organic resources and fertilizers, because the two of them then complement each other in terms of supply of nutrients and in terms of in terms of handling issues related to the soil physical parameters that are required for the crop to perform. It's important to think of that we talked about that the productivity is going down. There are various ways of reversing the decline in productivity. The first graph that I show here is the one that I showed earlier on, and so it shows the degradation of carbon over time. There's another one that was showing degradation of nitrogen over time. The second graph in the right is a graph of inputs of various organics of different qualities that was done by a team from TSBF CIAT. And so what it shows is that it's possible to, the line below here shows a decline from when the forests were converted to the period to the 120 years later. And this decline was consistent, that across those years, those decrease in maize production, up to the time it hit something between the 0.2 and 0.6 tons per hectare. But with inclusion of organic resources, we are seeing an improvement of production over time up to the point that it hits the 120 per hectare. But there's one organic resource here that almost brings the production to the level that it was 120 years ago, implying that the losses that are seen in terms of production as land degrades from the time it's converted from the natural system, from the natural forest to 120 years later of continuous cropping, there are certain ways of reversing those trends over time. One thing that we see is that even these carbon losses, there is possible to sequester sufficient amount of carbon by use of various technologies. There could be agroforestry technologies, could be various other forms of ISFM, and any system that improves the crop production, then it means that it's also improving the biomass, the below ground biomass and above ground biomass. The roots release a lot of carbon as exudates and lysates, and ultimately there is improvement in terms of the carbon resources that are left in the soil. But the system's working better if the above ground biomass is also incorporated. And therefore that can be taken as a way of reversing the loss in productivity and reversing degradation that has taken time over time, from the time that you convert it from the natural system, like in grassland or forest, to agriculture that is run as continuous cropping for a long period of time. There are potential trade-offs even as we talk about reversing degradation and the inclusion of using fertilizers. We know that in greenhouse gas emissions have been there's a link between inputs of nutrients and the greenhouse gas emissions, especially nitrogen. And the table I show here is greenhouse gas emissions from various nutrient management technologies in Embu, Kenya, that was done by my friend Macharia. And so what we see is that methane is not a problem, because the methane sink strength of most of the soils that we have in most of these countries is usually high. Methane, you'll find it mostly in conditions that are more anoxic, because it's a carbon reduction process that leads to methane emission. And therefore, other than in the rice paddies and in other places that are waterlogged, wouldn't be so much concerned about methane. But nitrous oxide is common where we include the nitrogen. What we show in the last column is the global warming potential. The global warming potential of such a system. And we can see like the manure up to that 341 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent, manure and the fertilizer 157 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent, fertilizer 91 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent, where the control is only around 33. We shouldn't be really worried, because even as we know that N accumulation could increase nitrous oxide, and the increased microbial and root respiration increases the carbon dioxide emissions. We have approaches like 4R nutrient stewardship, and the 4R nutrient stewardship, because it allows application of the fertilizer at the right time, at the right place, at the right rate and the right time, basically matching the application of nitrogen to the crop demand. Then it doesn't leave so much nitrogen. It doesn't leave too much nitrogen in the soil that will then undergo the processes of either denitrification or nitrification to form nitrous oxide emissions. So there is a need for intervention with such methodologies like the four nutrient stewardship to decrease the ability of nitrogen to convert to nitrous oxide emission. Because ultimately the nitrogen that is left in the soil then would act as the substrate. If that is not done, the nitrogen that is left in the soil would act as a substrate for nitrous oxide emission. Climate variability is a common problem in East Africa. The first crop you see there is a crop that we undergrown. It's a crop that was promising to hit almost 5 tons per hectare if you look at it very well. But then within a short time, there was drought, and the drought drained that crop. The crop on the right is the crop where there were tined ranges for water retention. And so you can see that the crop was not affected by the drought. The place looks green. And therefore, the second graph shows some of the methods that we are using to deal with the climate variability and its effects on the crops in East Africa. There are various other methodologies like the ZIPIT, the contour fallows, and many other methods that we are using to deal with the issues related to the climate variability. Even as we develop all those technologies and as we think about the science, is important to reach the end users, because if we don't reach the end users, then that just remains science. The range of techniques that are available and that we are using to reach the end users, who are basically the farmers, the extension workers, the policymakers, and other people make use of such knowledge, including the fertilizer industry. Other people make use of such knowledge. These techniques include the field days that we hold out there to train the farmers, the mother and the baby demos. Basically, the mother demos are the ones that we use to train the extension and the policymakers, but the baby demos are the small types of demos that we set in the farmer's field so that the farmers can see even within their own environment, crop yields can be increased through certain interventions. The other technique is the train of trainers, or what some other institution will call the variance-based devices. We also use the digital extension, and the digital extension becomes important because with a decrease in the number of extension staff in Africa, then it's more complex to reach a large number of farmers. So with interventions in digital extension, you can easily roll the SMS, you can easily roll other types of digital extension to reach many farmers. We also do the reference materials and the guides. The reference materials are important for extension workers because even when we leave them out there, then they'll reference once we are gone, and they will know exactly how to intervene. So this is one example of the trainer of trainers, or the variance-based devices. And so the way the method works is that if you look at the inner circle that is green, and assuming that the bigger circle, the bigger wheel there is APNI. APNI would train a number of extension workers. And if we train like 10 extension workers, then the conditions that we give them as we work together is that we train 10 extension workers. Each extension worker is supposed to train 20 variance-based devices. And each of the 20 variance-based devices is supposed to reach 100 farmers. So we are using this methodology. It's one of the methods APNI is using to reach the 120,000 farmers who we are targeting in a country like Kenya with the best management practices. At least we've trained 1,200 variance-based devices, and each of these 1,200 variance-based devices is given a task to reach 100 farmers. And so 100 times 1,200 then is the 120,000 farmers that I'm talking about. This is an example of digital extension systems that are digital extension platforms that we are using, some designed by our partners. There are some that are designed by Microsoft. There are some that are designed by various other partners. And so that's a variance-based advisor being trained on how to use the digital extension so that he can be able to train others on how to use them, and start rolling out messages that can spread across various regions where we work. These are some of the results of surveys that were done, preliminary data about the ICT-enabled digital extension. And so what it shows is that digital extension improves the adoption rates. It could help to increase the yield because farmers get messages at the right time when they're about to plant. It could help to increase the farmer income. They don't bring in fertilizers, and they are because of applying them wrongly, get into losses. It shows that the return in farmer income per every dollar that is invested can be high when such methods are used. And there's a cost saving. There's generally cost savings from movement of extension and other people from one region to the other to advise the farmers. APNI is highly associated with the nutrient experts, and so we also generate site-specific fertilizer recommendations and train extension workers and farmers on how to use them. The photo I showed there is one of our partners. Explaining to an extension worker how to develop fertilizer recommendations for the farmers in his region, in his region of operation. And so the good thing with these recommendations is that they can be developed for a site, they can be developed for a village, they can be developed for an administrative area, they can be developed for a region. So these are recommendations then that are able to capture the situations within a farm, and deliver recommendations that are more specific to that specific farmer. For example, a farmer who has manure and other supplies of organics that would have nutrients would get a recommendation that takes cognizance of the fact that this farmer has manure that will apply, and therefore it doesn't have to go for the same quantities of DAP or other fertilizers from the markets as that farmer does not have manure. Again, it looks at the land management and what land management effect has earned on the soil fertility, and therefore gives recommendations that it takes cognizance of the indigenous nutrients that are within the soil in that specific farm. So these are some of the results that we got in a study that we carried out in Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Nigeria. This graph is for Ethiopia, and so the first column shows the NE, which is the nutrient expert. The ST is the soil test, is the recommendation based on the soil test. The RR is a recommendation based on the regional recommendation, and the CR is the control. So what you see is that the nutrient experts, irrespective of being much more cost effective, is almost measuring to the same level as the soil test recommendation, the regional recommendation, and the regional recommendation. So whereas most of the farmers complain about soil testing, then this sort of recommendations can be offered to the farmer at a much lower cost. The graph that is purple shows the cost implication, the cost of nutrient expert, the cost of soil test, the cost of regional recommendation, and so it shows that generally the cost of nutrient expert is much lower, implying that the farmers might find it much easier to adapt the nutrient expert recommendation, because for the other type of recommendations, they would either require to take the samples to the lab, or they would require the regional recommendation, they would require an extension worker to come by, and the other costs associated with that. Again, the nutrient experts would allow the nutrients to be applied as to when they're required, because as to when they're required and the rates that is required. Again, because of that, dealing with the issues of greenhouse gas emissions like nitrous oxide emission. We also develop a range of materials and communication guides, and this range of materials are accessible from the APNI website. And so we develop these materials for scientists, for extension, for farmers, for the policymakers, so that they can act as the reference materials and the guides. It's important to realize that training farmers is crucial. We also do a lot of training for farmers, and when we train them, we give them materials for reference. Thank you so much. That's the end of the presentation.
Thank you very much, James, for this excellent presentation, very informative and very instructive, and right from the field, directly linked and connected to the field and farmers. That's excellent work.
Thank you so much.
Yes, I believe that science will not be useful if we do not connect to the farmers in the fields. And thank you very much. We have counted the number. We have about 52 viewers. Maybe Mr. Osama will tell me that we had more viewers from around the world. And we have a number of questions. And let me just dash through some questions and read them to you. Okay.
Yes, please.
Yes. Yeah. You have many people congratulating you. Professor Abu Drar from the National School of Agriculture of Meknes, a school that has been existing since 1942. It's almost over than 75 years of teaching, research, and extension in agriculture, and certainly has contributed much to training youth there. So let me see. Yes, the question of Dr. Abu Drar is the integration of animal and crop production. And he says when you have animals on the farms, usually they take much of that organic matter, which is vital for conserving the soil and for maintaining soil fertility. So what do you think about what's the status in Africa? Can you let us know?
Yes, is a common challenge to tell farmers to return the organic resources from their farms back to the farm immediately after harvest. And the farmers require usually like the pathway whereby first of all they feed that organic resource to the animals and then they return the manure to the animal. It's important to understand that when we look at the food systems, we have both the contribution of the crops and the animals. And so the two of them are actually complementary in terms of food security of most of the farming systems that we have in Africa. Nevertheless, passing the organic resource through the animal, through the animal, and bringing it back as manure, also has certain advantages to the crops, because by the time it's brought back in a more synthesized form, and in such a way that the effect of that organic resource can be noticed within a much shorter time than if we were to introduce some of the residues with the high carbon nitrogen ratios that would lead to immobilization in the first and the second season. So farmers do not return those organic resources immediately, but they return the manure back to the farm. We are also in the process of training those farmers that are returning manure is very important, and therefore, because there are also competing uses of manure as well, there are certain farmers, especially in certain regions that we work in Ethiopia, who use manure for firewood, use manure for housing. So there are those competing uses, but we give the farmers knowledge so that they can make the right decision. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Abu Drar continues asking his question, what is the solution to solve this problem, in your opinion?
The greatest solution is knowledge.
Yes.
Because for many years, there are places where farmers do not know how to connect the introduction of nutrients through organic resources and the crop production. So training farmers becomes an important entry point for getting more of the organic resources used in the farms.
I think you are doing a great job. And his second question, I'm going to show it over here. And he says carbon sequestration in soil is an important climate change mitigation technique. What would be the limit of sustainability of this sequestration on soil with intense mineralization?
Carbon sequestration is definitely very important because it's both connected to climate change, but also the soil organic matter is also connected to the ability of the soils to hold the nutrients and to release those nutrients, and also to provide a certain sort of physical parameter, to improve on the soil physical parameters. So we know there are certain systems that would give very high level, that would have very high levels of carbon sequestration, and other systems that would have low levels of carbon sequestration. Like when I presented, I showed some of the low quality materials like the biochar and other materials that would have this ICN values that would sequester more carbon than those systems that have the high quality, like the tephrosia, the tephrosia that would, which decompose very fast, release nutrients very fast, nutrients that and mineralize very fast to release nutrients, and within a very short time, that carbon is then released back to the atmosphere and during decomposition. So again, is identifying those systems that sequester more carbon and promoting those systems. We find that organics would sequester more, basically sequester more carbon than fertilizers, because fertilizers would tend to lose their carbon very fast. The carbon tend to get lost very fast. And so the integration of organic resources and the fertilizers also is crucial, because as the crop grows more and the yields improve, the biomass improves, then there is more deposition of the carbon through lysates and exudate into the soil. And so even when the much more biomass is incorporated, there's more carbon brought back to the soils. Back to you.
Thank you. Yes. The next comment is from our colleague, Professor Khalil El-Mujahed from UM6P. He is thanking you very much for your presentation. And he says, we need norms for soil fertility map, predict crop response and fertilizer need. Are they available for local conditions or being developed, or you used external norms?
They are not widely available, but there are initiatives to improve availability of those maps. Like there are maps that have recently been launched by ISDA, there are maps that were recently released by CropNet. So we are seeing a trend of developing those maps, whereas before such maps were not available, and those that were available are outdated, and the scale that were done was a scale that was not applicable at the local level. We are starting to see maps that are done at a scale that will be applicable at a local level, and they are starting to become more common out there through the donor investments. The governments themselves are starting to get concerned about the nature of the soils and the nature of fertilizer recommendations that are being given to the farmer. And therefore, there's push for more development of maps, and the maps are getting available over time.
The next question is by Mohammed Zakaria. I guess he's from UM6P also. And he says, to which level farmers in East Africa are aware of soil testing importance? They do infrequent soil testing to be able to manage the soil?
Yes, a good question. And let me say that in East Africa, we have had problems with the soil testing, starting from the number of laboratories that are available, because there are very few laboratories. Actually, for certain regions, as far as Ethiopia, they would analyze their samples in the ICRAF lab or CropNet lab. For even regions like Tanzania would ship samples to some places to analyze. But over time, there has been development of new methodologies like the spectral and the mobile labs that are moving across different regions. A case in example is the OCP school lab. There is the soil care. There is the soil care labs. There is the spectral labs in ICRAF that have speeded the process of analysis of samples and the blood analysis closer to the farmer. And therefore, this is increasing the levels at which farmers are analyzing their samples. Let me say we are not yet there in terms of getting the large number of farmers taking their samples for analysis, but this knowledge is becoming more common across areas where it was not common in the past. Back to you.
Next question is from Mr. ESAFE Is. And he says, thanks for your excellent presentation. Please, could you give us some explanation about the relationship between nutrient management and climate change, comparing sandy soils and clay soils in irrigated land and in arid land?
Yeah. Quite a mouthful, huge question. But let me say that nutrient management is crucial in as far as regulating the effect of the fertilizers that we apply and other sources of nutrients that we apply on the soils to the greenhouse gas emissions. Let me start with the nitrous oxide and say that we know nitrous oxide is a byproduct of nitrogen, either through denitrification or nitrification. And we know that one of the conditions under which nitrous oxide then gets synthesized to nitrous oxide is in conditions whereby there is more of it in supply in the soil than the crops are demanding. And so that cuts across all the kind of land use systems. That if you have more nitrogen in the soil and then the conditions are wet and warm, which are the conditions that are required by the microbes that are responsible for nitrous oxide from synthesis and emission, then you are likely to form more nitrous oxide. Within the soil, we talk of the microsites and the way the pores are connected. And therefore, in scenarios where the pores are disconnected, either disconnected due to breakage of the soil structure, then within that soil, there's formation of microsites that are anoxic, that would allow the denitrifiers to drive and they convert more of nitrogen to nitrous oxide. It also requires that those soils do not have appropriate gas diffusion into the soil, because if nitrous oxide has been formed deep from the soil and is being emitted, and there's oxygen that is getting into the soil, it's likely to be converted back to nitrate. For methane, like I said, is emitted more in the flooded areas and also like in irrigation of lice. And so it's more of, again, the denitrifiers, because methane is produced by bacteria that is known as methanogens. And the methanogens, will find them proliferating more again in places where the conditions do not have sufficient oxygen. So you then find that in places where soils are well aerated, like most of the upland soils most of these other places where soil is well aerated, you not find more of methane emissions. For CO2, the CO2 is a result of microbial and root respiration. And as long as we put inputs that will decompose, we expect more of CO2 being released due to the decomposition that is taking place, that the microbial activities are high. But then we produce CO2 and that decomposition takes place and it releases nutrients to the soils, and the crop grows better, and that the crop takes more of CO2 from the atmosphere and put it back into the soil, and it releases back to the soil through various root processes. And when those resources are brought back into the soil, they also add more of carbon that was taken as CO2 from the atmosphere by the crop during the processes of photosynthesis. I don't know whether I've answered it fully, but that's the answer I can give at this point in time. Back to you, Mohammed.
Here is another. Thank you. Here is another question from Mr. Ainaram from Madagascar. We are happy to see you regularly on our webinar. That's good. He says, very interesting presentation, Dr. Motegi, that can be combined with soil conservation as well. Can you advise some crop systems by nutrient management taking into account climate variability?
Yes. So yes, it can be combined with the soil conservation, because in most of the places where I've spoken about, where I've given this presentation, I've been mentioning the role of water in terms of erosion, the role of water in terms of flooding places, that erosion will carry away the nutrients, deposit them maybe in the water bodies. If we look further down, there is the processes of eutrophication of the water and losses of those ecosystem type of services that you get from water. But also conservation in terms of also carrying away the nutrients and loading them further downstream, where if it's nitrogen, that nitrogen would act as a source, would ultimately convert to nitrous oxide and would be released to the atmosphere. Conservation, we know that the tillage system for a long time, systems that are able to sustain the organic resources within the soil, because when you turn those organic resources, then within a very short time, you enhance the processes of decomposition and the mineralization, and therefore the carbon degradation rates take place at a faster level. So there is definitely complementarity between conservation and the nutrient management systems that I've spoken about, and the two of them should be encouraged simultaneously. Back to you, Mohammed.
Yeah. So, Mr. Anselm Kwame, a master's student at UM6P, says, congrats, Dr. James. Thank you for your brilliant presentation. And he has a question to you. Instead of soil mapping, in which extent yield mapping could help farmers for better fertilizer management?
Yes, thank you so much. The soil mapping all farmers, because they are used as the basis of identification of places that have deficiency of certain nutrients. So using them, then recommendations are developed, and those farmers, if recommendations are developed for their farms and they're given the appropriate recommendation, they don't then need to go for the fertilizers that do not match the deficiencies that they have on the farm, and therefore they get more units per unit of the fertilizer that they apply. That is improved nutrient use efficiency. And so they don't incur losses relating to applying nutrients that they don't require, or substituting nutrients that they require with the nutrients that they don't require. Back to you, Mohammed.
Okay. Another question by Mr. Patrick Kimararungu, and he says, what is the importance of mixing organic manure and industrial fertilizers? As we know, organic farming is important.
Yes. Let me say that is mainly because of the question of the synchrony of nutrient release and the asynchrony of nutrient release. And you find that when you're using organic resource, those nutrients are not immediately available for the crop that you're planting, and you don't have a way of determining when those nutrients will be released, because the release of those nutrients is controlled by climatic factors. It's controlled by rainfall, moisture, and the different other factors that you don't have control. And therefore, you are not able to determine exactly when those nutrients are released, especially when those nutrients are released, and how that matches with the crop demand at different phases of crop growth. For the fertilizers, you find that because of the way fertilizers are made, it's possible to match, it's possible to apply at different phases when the crop demand the nutrients that are in those fertilizers. And therefore, you're able to synchronize the crop demand for nutrients with the availability of those nutrients in the soil. The reason I talked about the mixing of the two is because whereas the organic resources are very crucial in terms of sort of physical parameters like water, improving the water holding capacity, and improving the polarity of the soil, and we know the pores are crucial for root, for pathways for roots to penetrate the soil. That is crucial for improved nutrient use efficiency. And so when you combine the two of them with the fertilizer, then the crop benefits from both the effect of the organic resources in terms of that have improved the physical properties for the crop to grow, and they also benefit from the fast release of nutrients from the fertilizers that have been timed to match with the different phases of crop nutrient demand. Of course, over time, those organic resources will also release the nutrients because, like we say, the soil organic matter is the reservoir of nutrients. Over time, they'll release those nutrients, and those nutrients will run into the fertility of the soil. But remember, those nutrients do not match the crop growth, the crop demand at different growth phases. So those nutrients will probably be used in another season by another crop that will be planted. Back to you, Mohamed.
The one before last. A question from Satmak Damwish. So this is a good opportunity for me to learn all about these names. So in any case, Satmak Damwish says, thank you, Dr. James. I want to know if the available water capacity will also increase when fertilizer, such as NPK, is added to the soil, as in the case of organic matter, as you mentioned earlier.
The available water increases more with organic resources. With the inorganic fertilizers, it increases over time as the improvement in crops and the roots continue to decay in the soil, and therefore hand the organic resources into the soil. But again, you can see that I'm still associating it for the organic resource, for the inorganic fertilizer. I'm still going back to associate it with the fact that the roots won't be left in the soil, and the roots are also organic resources. So yes, if you do inorganic fertilization over a long period of time, you're also likely to find improvement in the available water, but it takes much a longer time than when you're using the organic resources. And the improvement in water as a function of inorganic resources is much lower. It's much lower, probably 10 to the power of negative 9 or something like that, compared to the improvement in available water resulting from organic resources. Back to you, Mohamed.
Okay. Even our professor of management and entrepreneurship, Dr. Ahmed Dahbani, is thanking you for the interesting presentation. So that's good. And yes, I was going to ask a question, but then I have seen a question popping up from our conservation agriculture expert, Dr. Rashid Murabat. He's thanking you for the nice presentation, and he says, please, can you elaborate on differences between diagnosis and recommendation integrated systems, DRIS, and multiple nutrient omission trials? How about foliar diagnosis, as spatial variability is high?
Yeah, all those things should actually be included in development of fertilizer recommendations, because you require the mapping, you require the nutrient omission trials. Nutrient omission trials are the ones that show you are the ones that you use to identify those nutrients that are actually important in the recommendation and those nutrients that are not important in the recommendation. And therefore, you don't want to include the nutrients that are not important in the recommendation within the recommendation. And also, then I've forgotten part of the question. Could you please come again? Mohammed, I forgot. It was a very heavy question. I forgot parts of the question. Back to you, Mohammed.
Yes, yes.
I forgot part of the question. It was a very long question.
Yeah, it is written on the screen, if you can read it. And he says, how about foliar diagnosis as spatial variability is high?
Yes.
He's asking, yes.
Yes, all those things are important. And like I said, the spatial variability within these soils is very high. And so the foliar diagnosis is crucial in terms of identifying those patches within the farm then that do not contain, that have deficiency of certain nutrients. So ultimately, all these things should be integrated together if you are to develop a very efficient fertilizer recommendation for the farmers. Back to you, Mohammed.
Is on my own, and they do not require sophisticated science. I've seen you have shown us those slopes that are eroded. Yes. Why can't we plant them with shrubs and small trees?
That is actually one of the interventions that most of the partners in these regions are using, because an institution like ICRAF is actually using most of those species in the NGOs. And the beauty of those NGOs is that eventually they form an edge that only protect the soil from being carried down slope by water. And eventually a sort of vegetative driven type of atellus develops around the NGOs. And in addition to those NGOs acting as a tellus that controls the water, because it's biological in nature, farmers are able to use the leaves and other resources they get from those terraces to feed their livestock and bring the manure back into the system. So it's a common thing. It's a common thing in the region.
Okay, we have gone 23 minutes over the allocated time, and I would like to thank you very much, and I would like to congratulate you on the efforts you are making on the field to reach out to the farmers, because that's where I think our progress, most of our progress in Africa lies. We know much of the science. You have been working on your doctorate in Denmark and your BSc and your other diplomas. We know enough science. That's my point. And we need to go out to the farmers and just convey what we already know. And I congratulate you for these continued efforts, and I thank you again for hosting most of our students for their internship and assisting them, advising them. We appreciate that very much, and we'd like to convey that to the APNI top management. And with that, I will close this webinar, or at least the presentation and Q&A session, and I'll ask Mr. Usama to put up those information ads about our programs at ESAFE. Yes. And yeah, thank you. So ESAFE now has, I think we still have some days. No, it's the last day of registration, of application. And I guess if you have missed this, you can try today before 24 hours. And you have the information on the screen. And I guess it's about time. Well, I think it's about closure. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Osama. Thank you, James. Thank you very much, and hope to see you some other times for another talk. And
Bye bye.
bye
Thank you.
bye. Bye bye.